the 3 stages of childhood. As a result of yesterday's lecture, I was asked about our subject, and I would like to answer it here. The question is this: in regard to the principle of imitation in a child's movements, I would like you to explain something. My grandfather died when my father was around 1.5 years to 2 years old. Later, when he was about 45, my father visited one of my grandfather's friends, who was astonished at the similarity between my father's movements and gestures and those of my grandfather. What was the cause of this? Because of my grandfather's early death, it could hardly be a matter of imitation. A man died when his son was 1.5 years to 2 years old, and long afterward, when the son was 45, he heard from this friend, who was able to know that even as late as 45 years old, he imitated, or rather had the same gestures as his father. Here we are dealing, of course, with matters in which one can do little more than provide certain guidelines without any detailed explanations. Unfortunately, our lecture courses are short, and to cover this theme fully would require many lectures, perhaps 6 months or even a year. Many such questions are likely to arise, and it may be possible to answer them if they are presented, but I must point out that because of our limited time, there will be a certain lack of clarity which cannot be made clear unless it were possible to go into every detail fully. With reference to the question asked, I should like to offer the following remarks. If we consider the first period of a child's life between birth and the change of teeth, a child's organization works and develops in such a way that predispositions are incorporated into the organism. I described this yesterday as walking, including the general orientation of human beings, speaking, and thinking. And this is how events follow one another. Between the 1st and 7th year of life, children are organized so that they are concerned primarily with gesture. Between around the 7th to the 14th years, they are concerned with speech, as I explained yesterday. And approximately between the 14th and 21st years, they are organized so that they are concerned mainly with thinking. What thus appears in the course of 21 years is already taking shape as predispositions during the first period of life, between birth and the change of teeth. During the first third of the first period of life, or during the first 2 and a third years of life, the assimilation of gestures takes place. This includes walking freely without support, so that the arms and the muscles of the face can move in an expressive way. That is a general orientation and finding a living relationship to gestures and movements. The main development of children during this period is the development of gestures, which then continue to develop, but now something more intimate and inner is impressed into the speech organism. Even if a child has already spoken a few words, the experience of speech as predisposition does not occur before children are a little older than 2.5. The actual experience and feeling for speech is fully developed between the 7th and 14th year, but as predisposition it is present between 2 and a third and 4 and 2/3 years. Of course, this must be taken as an average. After that, children develop a faculty for the beginning of the inner experience of thought. What develops and blossoms later, between 14 and 21, is already germinating between 4 and 2/3 and 7 years old. The formation of gestures continues, of course, throughout these years, but other faculties also come into play. Thus we see that essentially we must place the time of gestural development and formation back to the first 2.5 years. What we gain during this time lies deepest. And this is only natural, since we can certainly imagine how fundamental the principle of imitation is during these first years of life. If you consider all of this together, you will not be surprised by the events that led to this question. The grandfather died when the father was between 1.5 and 2 years old, precisely the time when the formation of gesture is working most deeply. If the grandfather died then, the gestures the child imitated then made the deepest impression. This does not alter what may have been imitated later from others. So this particular case has extraordinary significance when considered in detail. Yesterday we tried to describe how, as children develop during the second period of life, between the change of teeth and puberty, they experience everything expressed through speech, in which the natural authority of the teacher must play a role. The interaction between teacher and child must work in a pictorial, imaginative way. I pointed out how at this age We cannot approach children with moral precepts. Rather, we can affect their moral character only by awakening feelings in them with pictures. In this way, the children take in images described by their teacher, who also acts as their model. The images work in such a way that goodness pleases them, and they develop a distaste for what is bad. Consequently, at the elementary school age, morality must be instilled through pictures, by way of feelings. I also explained that writing must be presented to children through images, and that the forms of letters must be developed through drawn paintings and painted drawings. Of all the arts, this must be cultivated first, since it leads children into culture. From an educational perspective, it is totally inappropriate to begin by introducing children to letter forms which are alien to them. The fixed forms of letters as used today work on children like little demons. When education is based on knowledge of the human being, children must learn to write before learning to read. If you wish to approach children of this age immediately after the change of teeth, as much as possible, you must approach the whole being of the children. When children are writing, it activates the whole upper body. The inner flexibility of children is different than it would be if only the head is busy learning the forms of letters. The liberated, independent faculties of the head cannot be used until a later age. Thus we can create a transition by allowing children to read what they have written, which makes an impression on them. Because of this method of teaching at the Waldorf school, our children learn to read a bit later than others do, and they learn to write letters later than the children in other schools. One cannot really judge this fact, however, without a true understanding of human nature. Usually people today have a limited perception and sense of the human being, and do not notice how harmful it is for general human development when children learn reading and writing too early. These things are too far removed from them. Certainly the children whose proficiency in these arts is attained somewhat later than others will not experience any lack in their capacity to read and write. On the other hand, those who learn to read and write too early will certainly suffer in this respect. Education, based on a knowledge of the human being, must from the very beginning arise from this ability to read human evolution. By understanding the conditions of life, we can help children develop their own nature. This is the only way toward a truly healthy education. To gain deeper understanding, we must penetrate the human being. First, the human being consists of a physical body, which is developed most intensively during the first period of life. The main development during the second period is the higher and finer body, the ether body. It is very important that when we study the human being, we do so in a truly scientific way, and we must invoke a degree of courage equal to that shown in other areas of modern science. A substance that shows a certain degree of warmth can be brought to a state in which that warmth, which has been bound up with the substance, is freed. It is liberated and becomes free warmth. In the case of mineral substance, we have the courage to speak scientifically when we say that there is bound warmth and free warmth. We must have the same courage when we study the world as a whole. If we have the courage, the following reveals itself to us in regard to the human being. Where are the forces of the ether body during the first period of life? They are bound up with the physical body and are active in its nourishment and growth. In this first period, children are different from what they become later. All the forces of the ether body are initially bound up with the physical body. At the end of the first period, they are freed to some extent, just as warmth is freed from a substance with which it had been bound. What happens now? After the change of teeth, only part of the ether body is active in the forces of growth and nourishment. The part that has been liberated now carries on the more intensive development of memory and soul qualities. Because it is a fact, we must learn to speak of the soul as bound during the first 7 years of life, and to speak of the soul as liberated after the 7th year. What we use as soul forces during the second 7-year period of life is during the first 7 years imperceptibly bound up with the physical body, when nothing psychic can be free of the body. We can gain knowledge of how the soul works during the first 7 years by observing the body. Only after the change of teeth can we directly approach what is purely of a soul nature. This way of viewing matters leads directly from the physical to the psychological. Consider the myriad approaches to psychology today. They are based on speculation, pure and simple. People think matters over and discover that on the one hand we have a soul and on the other a body. We must ask, does the body give rise to and work on the soul, or does it work in the opposite direction? If they do not manage to get any further either way, people discover something extraordinarily bizarre: psychophysical parallelism, the notion that both manifestations run parallel. As a result, no explanation is given for the interaction between them. One speaks only of parallelism. This indicates that nothing is known through experience about these matters. Experience leads one to say that during the first 7 years of life in children, one perceives the soul working in the body. The way this works must be learned through observation, not merely through speculation. Spiritual science, as a way of knowledge, completely rejects speculation and always proceeds from experience, physical and spiritual experience, of course. So, during the second period of life, between the change of teeth and puberty, the human ether body is our main concern in education. Above all, both teacher and child need the forces at work in the ether body, because they release the child's feeling life, not judgment and thought. Deeply embedded in the nature of children, between the change of teeth and puberty, is the third member of the human being, the astral body, which bears all feelings and sensations. During this period, the astral body is still deeply embedded in the ether body. Thus, because the ether body has now become relatively free, it is our task to develop it, so that it can follow its own tendencies, which are helped by education, not hindered. When can it be helped? This happens when we teach children through pictures, in the broadest sense. Everything we wish them to absorb we build imaginatively and in images. The ether body is the body of formative forces. It models the wonderful forms of the organs, the heart, lungs, liver, and so on. The physical body, which we inherit, acts only as a model. After the first 7 years, after the change of teeth, it is laid aside, and a second physical body is formed by the ether body. This is why, at this stage, our educational methods must be adapted to the formative forces of the ether body. We must proceed in such a way that children gradually learn to find their orientation in the world. I have already said that I find it very repugnant when I see a scientific textbook that has been brought to school for the purpose of teaching along those lines. Today's science, which I acknowledge fully, has deviated in many ways from a world view that truly accords with nature. Now let's just ask ourselves a question, bearing in mind that as our discussion proceeds other matters may need to be added. What is the approximate age when we can begin to teach children about the plant world? We teach children by means of pictures, and they learn to write through painting and drawing. Indeed, it is never too early to introduce children to the arts, since all our teaching must be imbued with a feeling for art. In the same way, we must also keep this in mind. Just as the ether body is inseparable from the human formative and pictorial aspects, the astral body, which underlies the life of feelings and sensations, tends toward the musical nature of a person. So what do we look for when observing children? Because the astral body is embedded in the physical and etheric bodies of children between the change of teeth and puberty, if the soul life is healthy, it is also deeply musical. Every healthy child is profoundly musical. To invoke this musicality, we need only call on the children's own natural liveliness and sense of movement. Artistic teaching from the very beginning of school life should thus employ both the visual arts and music. We should never emphasize abstraction. An artistic approach is most important, and children must be led to comprehend the world out of the artistic. This must not be done too late or too early. We must be aware of a very important stage in the development of children between the ages of 9 and 10. Those who look with the eyes of a teacher see this in every child. Although they do not usually express it in so many words, a time comes when children reveal through their behavior that they have a question or several questions that betray an inner crisis. This is an extremely delicate experience in children, and we need an exceptionally delicate sense for such things to perceive it. It is present and can be observed. At this stage, children learn intuitively to differentiate themselves from the surrounding world. Before this age, the capital I and the outer world interpenetrate each other, and so we can tell the children stories about animals, plants, and rocks, whose actions make them seem human. Indeed, this is the ideal approach, because we should appeal to their pictorial, imaginative sense, and we do this by speaking this way about the kingdoms of nature. Between 10 and 11, however, children learn to say capital I in self-awareness. They learn this earlier, of course, but now they do it consciously. Once their consciousness is no longer merged with the outer world, and once they have learned to distinguish themselves from it, we can begin to help children understand the plant world with feeling, but without immediately renouncing the element of image and imagination. Today we are used to looking at one plant next to another. We learn their names and related information, and we do this as though a plant were there, independently. But when we study plants in this way, it is like pulling out a hair, forgetting that it was on your head, and examining it as though you can understand its nature and life conditions without considering that it grew from your head. The hair has meaning only when we consider the fact that it grew on a head. It cannot be studied in isolation. It is the same for a plant. We cannot pull it up and study it separately. We must consider the earth as an organism to which the plant belongs. This is what it is. Plants belong to the entire growth of the earth, just as a hair belongs to the head. Plants can never be studied in isolation, but only in relation to the whole nature of the earth. The earth and the world of plants belong together. Suppose you had a herbaceous plant, an annual, growing from its roots, shooting up into a stalk, leaves, and flowers, and developing the fruit that is planted again the following year. Then you have the earth in which the plant grows. Now think of a tree. A tree lives longer. It is not an annual. It develops a mineralized bark around itself from which pieces can be broken off. In reality, what sort of process is this? If you were to build up the surrounding earth and its inherent forces around a plant, more or less covering it with earth, then you would recreate this process synthetically in an outer mechanical way. Nature does the same thing, however, by wrapping the tree with the bark. But in this case it is not made completely of earth. The bark forms a kind of earth, mound, that piles itself up around the tree. When we look at a growing tree, we see the earth flourishing and growing. This is why the earth that surrounds the root of a plant must be considered a part of it. The soil belongs to a plant. If you have learned to observe such things and happen to travel in an area where you see many plants with yellow flowers, you will immediately try to see the sort of soil they grow in. In particular, wherever you see many yellow flowers, for instance, we are able to find somewhat reddish soil. You will never be able to think about the plant without considering the earth in which it grows. They go together. We should quickly become accustomed to this fact. Otherwise, we destroy our sense for reality. I was deeply impressed recently during an agricultural course I gave at the request of some farmers. Footnote, see Spiritual Foundations for the Renewal of Agriculture, 8 lectures, Kobrovitz, Silesia, June 7th through the 16th, 1924, Kimberton, Pennsylvania, Biodynamic Farming and Gardening Association, 1993. At the end of the lecture course, a farmer said, quote, "Everyone today knows that our vegetables are dying out and becoming decadent with alarming speed," unquote. Why is this? It is because people no longer understand, as peasants used to, that earth and plants are connected and must be considered in this way. If we want to nurture our vegetables so that they flourish again, we must understand how to treat them correctly. In other words, we must give them the right kind of manure. We must make it possible for the earth to live properly in the environment of the plant roots. Today, because agricultural methods of cultivation have failed, we need a new agricultural impulse based on spiritual science. This will enable us to use manure in such a way that plant growth does not degenerate. Those who are as old as I am know what European potatoes looked like 50 years ago compared to the way they look today. Today we see more than just a decline of Western culture. This decline also penetrates deeply into the kingdoms of nature, including agriculture. It really amounts to this. Our sense of the connection between plants and their environment should not be lost. On school outings and similar occasions, plants should not be pulled up, placed in specimen containers, and brought to the classroom in the belief that we accomplish something by doing this. Uprooted plants cannot exist by themselves. People today indulge completely false ideas. For example, they view a piece of chalk and a flower as having the same sort of reality, but this is nonsense. A mineral object can exist in itself. This is a fact. so people believe that the plant should also have an independent existence. But this is impossible, since it ceases to be a plant once it is pulled from the ground. It maintains its earthly existence only while it is attached to something other than itself, and that other has existence only insofar as it is part of the whole earth. We must study phenomena within the whole, not tear them out of it. Almost all knowledge based on observation is filled with unrealities of this kind. This is why natural science has become so abstract, though this is partially justified, as it is for the theory of relativity. But those who can think realistically do not allow abstract concepts to run on and on without noticing the point where they cease to have any relationship to reality. That would be painful. Naturally, you could use the principles of acoustics and say, when I make a sound, the sound travels at a certain speed. Wherever I hear a sound, I can calculate the exact time it took to reach me. If I move in the same direction in which the sound travels, regardless of my speed, I will hear it later. And if I were traveling faster than the speed of sound, I would not hear it at all. But by moving toward the sound, I hear it earlier. The theory of relativity is definitely reasonable, but according to this principle, we could also say that if I were to move toward the sound more quickly than the speed of sound, I would go beyond it and hear the sound before it is made. This fact should be obvious to anyone who can think realistically. Such a person also knows that it is absolutely logical and wonderfully thought out to say that if a clock, to use the well-known comparison of Einstein, is thrown at the speed of light into universal space and returns, it will not have changed at all. This can be thought through in a wonderful way. But those who think realistically must ask, what will the clock look like on its return? Realistic thinking does not separate the thinking from the reality, but always remains in the realm of reality. This is the essential characteristic of spiritual science. It requires more than mere logic. It approaches matters in accordance with reality. This is why people today who carry abstractions to the point of splitting hairs accuse anthroposophists of being abstract, simply because our way of thinking always looks for absolute truth and never loses its connection with reality, which must include an understanding of spiritual reality. This is why it is possible to see how unnatural it is to associate botany with specimens in a container. When we introduce children to botany, therefore, it is important to consider the earth's face, dealing with the soil and the growing plants together, so that children will never think of plants as detached and separate. This can be unpleasant for teachers who would simply like to bring the usual botany books to class, give them a quick glance during lessons, and then act as though they understand it all. I already said that there are no suitable textbooks on botany these days. And this sort of teaching assumes another aspect, once we understand the effect of imponderables, and when we consider that the subconscious works even more strongly in children than it does in older people. The subconscious is very clever, and those who are able to perceive children's spiritual life know this. When students are faced with a teacher who walks around the class with notes, while trying to convey the substance of these notes, the children always wonder why they should learn such information. After all, the teacher doesn't even know it. This becomes a tremendous disturbance to the lessons, because those feelings arise from the subconscious. Nothing can be expected of a class taught by a teacher using notes. We must always look at the spiritual aspect of matters. This is especially true when we are developing an art of education, since this is how we give children a sense of standing firmly and safely in the world. They gradually come to understand that the earth is an organism, and in fact this is what it is. When soil begins to lose its vitality, we must help it by using manure in the right way. For example, it is not true that water in the air is the same as water in the earth. The water below has a certain vitality. The water above loses that vitality, which it regains only as it descends. These are facts, and absolutely real. If we fail to understand them, we cannot unite with the world in a real way. This, then, is what I wished to say in regard to teaching about the plant world. Now we come to the animal world, and we cannot view animals as belonging to the earth in the same way. The mere fact that the animals can move about makes this obvious. In this sense, they are independent. But when we compare animals with humankind, we find something characteristic in their formation. This was always indicated in the older instinctive science, the effects of which still existed at the beginning of the 9th century. Because of the way modern people look at things, however, when they read the views of natural philosophers who, following old traditions, consider the animal world's relationship to the world of humankind, their ideas seem foolish. I realize, for example, that people in a study group can hardly contain their laughter when they read this from the natural philosopher Oken, O-K-E-N, quote, "The human tongue is a cuttlefish," unquote. Footnote, Lawrence Oken, 1779 to 1851, the German transcendental naturalist and philosopher, wrote numerous natural philosophical and natural historical works. Between 1816 to 1848, as a professor in Jena, Oken published the periodical Isis, a forum for all academic subjects except theology and law. The periodical gave rise to controversy because of the political views expressed. Goethe, who had a personal enmity toward Oken and others, called for a ban on the periodical, and eventually both the magazine and Oken were banned from Jena. End of footnote. What could we have meant by this? In fact, this statement from Oken can no longer be considered correct, but it contains an underlying principle that we must take into account. When we observe the various animal forms, from the tiniest protozoa to the most fully developed apes, we find that they all represent some part of the human being, a human organ or an organic system that has developed in a one-sided way. You don't need to look at these things in a very deep way. Just imagine that the human forehead enormously withdrawn, the jaw jutting out, the eyes looking upward instead of toward the front, the teeth and their whole organization formed in a one-sided way. By imagining such extreme developments, you can picture a great variety of mammals. By eliminating one thing or another in the human form, you can change it into an ox, a sheep, and so on. When you can consider the inner organs, for example, those related to reproduction, you enter the area of the lower animals. The human being is a synthesis or assembly of individual animal forms that become softer and gentler when united. The human being is made up of all the animals formed into a harmonious structure. Thus, when I look for the original forms that merge in the human being, I find the whole animal world. The human being is a condensation of the whole animal world. This view restores our soul's proper relationship to the animal world. It has been forgotten, but it is nevertheless the correct view, and because it is essential to the principles of evolution, it must be restored to life. We show children how the plant belongs to the earth. Then, when they are about 11 years old, insofar as this is possible today, we must begin to consider the animal world. We do this in such a way that we see the various animal forms in the human being. Consider the effect this has on children's relationship to animals and plants. Plants go into the earth and unite with it. Animals become one with the human being. This provides a basis for a real relationship to the world. It gives humankind a real relationship to the world. This can always be brought to children in connection with the subject matter. If this is presented to children in an artistic and living way, and if it corresponds to the capacity of their inner being, we give them the living forces they need to establish a relationship to life. On the other hand, it is easy to destroy that relationship by failing to look deeply at the whole human being. What, in fact, is the ether body? If it were possible to lift it out of the physical body and imbue it in such a way that its form became visible, there could be no greater work. The human ether body, by its own nature and through what we create within it, is simultaneously a work of art and the artist. When we introduce the formative element into the children's artwork, we allow them to sculpt with the freedom I described yesterday. What we bring them is deeply related to the ether body. This enables children to take hold of their inner being and thus, as human beings, claim their proper relationship to the world. By introducing children to music, we form the astral body. But when we put two things together, taking the formative into movement, and when we perform movements that are formative, we have eurythmy, which follows exactly the relationship between the ether and astral bodies in children. So now the children learn eurythmy, or speech, revealed in formed gestures, just as they learned quite naturally to speak in their earlier years. Healthy children have no difficulty learning eurythmy, because in eurythmy they simply express their own being. They have the impulses to express their own being. This is why, in addition to gymnastics, eurythmy is incorporated into the curriculum as a required subject from the first grades through the from the first years through the highest grades. You see, eurythmy arose from the whole human being, the physical, etheric, and astral bodies. It can be studied only by means of spiritual scientific knowledge of the human being. Today, gymnastics are directed physiologically toward the body in a lopsided way, because physiology cannot do otherwise. It introduces certain principles based on life-giving processes. Through gymnastics, however, we do not educate the whole human being, but only one aspect. This is not said to imply anything against gymnastics, but today the importance of gymnastics is overrated. Thus, in today's education, eurythmy should go hand in hand with gymnastics. I would not go so far as one well-known physiologist did. He happened to be in the audience when I spoke on eurythmy. I said that in terms of education, gymnastics are overrated today, and that a form of gymnastics calling on the forces of soul and spirit, as practiced in eurythmy along with the study of eurythmy as an art, must be introduced in addition to the usual gymnastics. At the end of my lecture, the famous physiologist approached me and said, quote, "Do you mean to tell me that gymnastics may be a valid means of education because physiologists say it is so? As a physiologist, I must tell you that gymnastics education is nothing less than barbaric," unquote. You would be very surprised if I told you the name of that physiologist. Today these things have become obvious to those who have some authority, and we must be careful not to advocate fanatically without full knowledge of everything involved. To become a fanatic over certain things is completely out of place in the art of education, because we are dealing with many different aspects of life. When we approach other subjects that children must be taught, and when we do so from the various views we have considered, we first come to the years when children can absorb only images through feelings. For example, history and geography must be taught in this way. History must be described in images. We paint and sculpt with words, which develops children's minds. During the first 2 stages of the second period of life, there is one thing above all to which children do not relate. We could call this the idea of causation. Before the 7th year, children should certainly not attend school. Footnote, kindergarten in this case is not considered to be school as such, end footnote. The time from 7 to just past 9 years of age is the first subdivision of the second main period of life. From just past 9 to just before 12 years old is the second stage. And from 11 years 8 months until around 14 is the third stage. During the first stage of the second period of life, children are organized so that they respond to images in a direct way. Therefore we must speak as we would in fairy tales, because everything must remain undifferentiated from the children's own nature. Plants must speak to one another, minerals must speak together, plants must kiss one another and have fathers and mothers. Around 9 years and 4 months, the self has been characterized. The capital I begins to differentiate itself from the outer world. Now we can take a more realistic approach when teaching about plants and animals. During the first years of life, however, history must always be approached in a fairy tale and mythical attitude. In the second division of this longer period, from about 9 years and 4 months until 11 years and 8 months, we must speak in images. It is only as they approach the age of 12 that we may introduce children to causation. Only then can we go into abstract concepts, allowing cause and effect to come into play. Before this, the idea of cause and effect is beyond the reach of children, just as colors are to those who are colorblind. As educators, we frequently have no idea how useless it is to speak to children about cause and effect. It is only after children reach the age of 12 that we can speak to them about things that are taken for granted when viewed from today's scientific perspective. It is thus essential that we wait until about the 12th year before dealing with anything related to the inorganic, since this means getting into the concept of causation. Also, when teaching history, we must wait until about this age before going from a pictorial presentation to one that involves cause and effect, when we look for the causes behind historical events. Before this, we should concern ourselves only with what we can present to children as life imbued with soul. People are very strange indeed. For instance, through the development of culture, a concept has arisen that we call, quote-unquote, animism. It is said that if a child bumps into a table, the table is seen to be alive and the child strikes back at it. Children dream a soul into the table, and it is believed that primitive people did the same. The idea is that something very complex occurs in the souls of children. They supposedly think that the table is actually alive with soul, and this is why they hit back when they bump into it. This is fantastic. On the contrary, those who study cultural history are the ones who actually do the ensouling, since they ensoul children with this imaginative capacity. The children's soul qualities are far more deeply embedded in the physical body than they are later on, when they are freed. When a child bumps into a table, a reflex occurs without any thought that the table is alive. It is a purely reflexive movement of will, since children do not yet differentiate themselves from the outer world. This differentiation does not appear until around the 12th year, when healthy children can grasp the concept of causation. If this concept is presented to children too early, especially in superficial external ways, terrible conditions are set up for the development. It's all very well to say that we should make sure everything is perfectly clear to a child. Calculators exist in which little balls are pushed around to make the mathematical operations visible. The next thing we may expect is that those with such an attitude will make moral concepts outwardly visible by using some kind of machine that pushes something around to show good and evil, just as calculators allow us to see that 5 plus 7 equals 12. There are undoubtedly areas of life in which things cannot be made visible and are nevertheless absorbed by children in ways that are not obvious at all, and it is a big mistake when we try to make them so. Hence it is very wrong to attempt, as is often done in textbooks, to make something visible that by its very nature cannot be treated in that way. People frequently become trivial in this way. During the years between the change of teeth and puberty, we are concerned not just with the obvious, because when we consider the whole of human life, something else also becomes obvious. At the age of 8, I absorb some concept. I do not yet understand it fully. In fact, I don't understand its abstract meaning at all. I am not yet constituted in a way that makes this possible. So why do I take in such a concept at all? It is because my teacher is speaking. My teacher's authority is a given, and it works on me. These days, however, we are not supposed to do this. Children are supposed to be shown only what is visible and obvious. Consider children who are taught everything in this way. Their experiences do not grow with them, because this method treats them as beings who do not grow. But we should not awaken ideas in children if those ideas are unable to grow with them. This is like making a pair of shoes for a 3-year-old and expecting that child to wear them at the age of 12. Everything in human beings grows, including the power of comprehension. Consequently, concepts must be able to grow as well. We must therefore make sure we bring living concepts to children. But we cannot do this unless children have a living relationship to the teacher's authority, and this cannot be accomplished by abstract, pedantic teachers who stand in front of children and give them concepts that are still completely alien to them. Imagine 2 children. One has been taught in such a way that even at the age of 45, she continues to take in concepts and explain them as she did at the age of 8. The concept has not grown with the child. She paid careful attention to it all, and at 45 she still explains it in the same way. Now consider the second child who has been educated in a living way. He no longer wears the same size shoes that he did when he was 8, and likewise at a later age he no longer carries around the same concepts that he learned when he was 8. On the contrary, those concepts have expanded and changed radically, and all of this affects the physical body. If we look at these 2 people in relation to their physical fitness, we find that the first person will have sclerosis by the age of 45, whereas the second has remained more flexible. How much do you think human beings differ? Someplace in Europe there were 2 philosophy professors. One was famous for his Greek philosophy. The other was an old adherent of the Hegelian school, in which people were still used to taking in living concepts, even after the age of 20. Both lectured at the same university. At 70, the first professor decided to exercise his right to retire, since he felt that he could not continue. A second, the Hegelian professor, was 91 when he said, quote, "I cannot understand why that young fellow is settling down to retirement already," unquote. The conceptual life of this second professor had remained flexible, and for this very reason people criticized and accused him of being inconsistent. The other man was consistent, but he suffered from sclerosis. There is a complete unity in children between spirit and body, and we cannot approach them correctly unless we consider this. Today, people who do not sympathize with materialistic views will say that materialism is bad. Why is that? Many say it is bad because it does not understand spirit. But this is not the worst thing about it, because little by little people will become aware of this lack and come to recognize spirit because of an urge to understand it. The worst thing about materialism is that it does not understand matter. Look into this for yourselves. You can see what has happened to knowledge of the living forces in the human lung, liver, and so on because of materialism. Nothing is known about how these things function. Something is left out of the lung and liver. It may be prepared and examined, but modern scientific methods cannot learn anything about the spirit that functions actively in human organs. Such knowledge can be learned only through spiritual science. Matter reveals its nature only when studied from the perspective of spiritual science. Materialism has become sick, mostly because materialists understand nothing about matter. They want to limit themselves to matter, but they cannot reach any real knowledge of what matter is. In saying this, I do not mean theorized matter, in which a certain number of atoms supposedly dance around a central nucleus. Such things are not very difficult to construct. In the early days of the Theosophical Society, some theosophists constructed a whole system based on atoms and molecules, but it was just theory. Now we have to approach reality again. If we actually do this, we become uncomfortable when we are expected to comprehend a concept entirely void of reality. It would be painful if someone were to promote a theory such as this one. For example, fundamentally it is the same thing whether you drive your car to town or the car remains immobile and the town comes to you. Certainly such things are justified when viewed from a certain perspective, but they impoverish the whole soul life when extended as they are today by those who hold completely abstract opinions. Those who have a sense for these things experience real pain when confronted by what people think today, and this works destructively on teaching methods as well. For example, I see the tendencies of certain methods that are applied to little kindergarten children. They are given the usual cut-out letters and then asked to pick them out of a pile and assemble them into words. By busying children this way at such an early age, we bring them things with which they have absolutely no connection. When this happens to them, it's as if we were to say, I was once a person with muscles, skin, and such, but now I am only a skeleton. This is the way it is today, because of the influence of our propensity for abstractions in spiritual life of humankind. One suddenly feels oneself as a skeleton. We cannot educate children with such a view, with a bare skeleton of reality. This is the main reason I wanted to show you today how crucial it is that teachers approach life in a true and living way.